All right, so thank you for joining us in what is the first in a series of RMI webinars on the 7 challenges for energy transformation and the work that we at RMI and a broad network of partners around the world are driving to address these challenges head on. This event is brought to you by Rocky Mountain Institute Solutions Council and Innovator Circle, and we wanted to particularly thank all of our Giving Circle members for joining us today and for the important role that they play in making RMI's work possible through their support. First, I'll cover some housekeeping. After a presentation and discussion from our panelists, we'll have about 20 minutes to address your questions that we'll pose to our panelists today. So you can submit your questions anytime during the webinar by typing them into the questions section of your control panel. Then we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A portion of our agenda. If we can't get to them all, don't worry, we'll be posting additional responses and comments alongside a recording of this webinar after we close on rmi.org. Now to introduce our topic and our speakers. So obviously you can't manage what you can't measure, so making emissions visible is an incredibly important lever to drive widespread emissions reductions at the rate and scale necessary to address the climate crisis. That's why it's the first of the 7 challenges. So today we'll hear from RMI's Paolo Natali. He is the director of the Materials Initiative and responsible for the COMET Method at RMI, which was recently launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And it's something that we're really excited about because of its potential for decarbonizing these really hard to abate industries. We'll also hear from Virginia Covo. She is the Global Director of Sustainability Supply Chain for Anheuser-Busch InBev. And Alana Fishman is also joining us today. She's the Vice President for Advisory Services at Cornerstone Government Affairs. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining today. And we will start by handing it over to Paolo. All right, over to you, Paolo.
Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thanks to everyone for being here and to talk with us about such a key subject as supply chain emissions. My name is Paolo Natali. And I'm leading the efforts at RMI to understand emissions visibility in supply chains. I will try to convince you today that such a dry subject as supply chain decarbonization is actually quite key to the topic of environmental stewardship and the collective goal that we have to contain global carbon emissions. I want to start by explaining what COMET is. So COMET is a coalition of industrial players that we have launched over the course of last year. And as a result of some conversations that we have had with 4 partners, ourselves at Rocky Mountain Institute, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, MIT Sustainable Supply Chains, and the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. So you have a group of nonprofit and academic players who have been trying to understand what could be done to unlock visibility of supply chain emissions. There is a growing momentum in industry to decarbonize products and processes, and this is where the idea of supply chain emissions comes from. I think I should first of all take a quick step to describe what it is that we are talking about. So according to the greenhouse gas protocol, emissions are divided into 3 main areas. You have or 3 scopes, as the GHG protocol says. You have scope 1 emissions that are direct emissions from operations, and then scope 2 emissions, that are emissions that happen as a result of electricity that is being used in direct operations. So scope 1 and 2 together would be the direct emissions of each industrial player. And then the scope 3 emissions, which is a very broad concept that puts together all the emissions from the entire supply chain of a product or of a material, and that depends on where in the supply chain that is looked at from. Over the last few years, really, as you know, companies have been under pressure from many angles to reduce emissions. It all started with direct emissions from operations, so the scope 1 and 2 emissions, as I said. Over the last decade, and especially the last few years, companies have started to be under much more pressure to decarbonize their supply chain. So not just looking into direct emissions, but creating this broader link to the entire supply chain. And that happens from several angles. You have consumers that are increasingly aware of the environmental impact of the products they use and want to be able to have lower carbon products, and manufacturers of goods, therefore, are under pressure to create the possibility of producing in a lower carbon manner, including how they source the products and the materials from the other steps of the supply chain. There is pressure from investors. The investor community is becoming aware of the climate risk exposure of their investments, and is starting to exercise pressure on the companies they invest in, either because they lend money or invested in equity as shareholders of the company. And then finally, there is an angle of policy pressure, policies coming up in various shapes and forms to promote the idea and regulate for lower carbon materials. For example, you can think of the buy clean policies that some states in the US have implemented for the procurement of buildings materials. Now, this is all great in the sense that there is a heightened attention towards supply chain emissions that is going to drive decarbonization in industry. There are also problems, and I want to start by explaining, or at least giving an idea of how large the problem side looks like. Now, you might have heard about the IPCC report and the concept that the world really needs to stay within a 1.5 degree containment of global warming by 2050 if we want to avert the climate crisis. This means that a lot of action needs to be taken among industrial sectors. Industry emits about 40% of total global emissions. And what you see here in the chart are what we are calling the hard to abate sectors, the heavy industrial sectors that either produce materials, as you can see in the left side of the chart, or that provide the logistics for supply chains. You see the transport side on the right-hand side. The problem with these sectors is that you see here superimposed what the overall carbon budget looks like if the world is to achieve a 1.5 trajectory by 2050. It's those, even in the least conservative scenario, you have 730 gigatons of CO2 that can be emitted between now and 2050. And you can see that if we don't change from the situation that we're in today, all of this carbon budget could be burned by just industrial sectors. The problem is, like I said, industry is supposed to be only 40% of this. Now, there is more bad news in the sense that right now, some companies have been doing important action to contain emissions, but the rewards on decarbonization are not really bankable, and I'll get to why, and I'll preview the answers that most of what is being done to decarbonize is hardly measurable. And so the question remains open to industrial players: what is the advantage of decarbonizing one's own operation? How does one monetize the kudos that come from doing the good thing, from making investments in the sense of decarbonization? This is not clear now. And finally, value chains are pretty complex in today's economy and global. And they involve, in many cases, a significant number of intermediate tiers of production. And the problem is that the demand for low carbon products that happen at the back end of the supply chain, in the case of consumers or at the investor side, does not manage to travel back up the supply chain where the hard to abate emissions are, which is in most cases at the very beginning of supply chains, in mining or in heavy in carbon intensive processes like steel making, for example. So this is the problem part. I will move to what we think is the key to the solution. The problem can be summarized in the fact that you cannot manage and therefore abate what you cannot accurately measure. And it seems pretty simple as an idea, but it gets really complex if you put it into the perspective of what I just said, that we have several tiers of production. In the cases of many supply chains, there's over a dozen or even 2 dozens of intermediary products, and it is really difficult to measure and appropriately allocate the CO2 emissions that refer to each part of the supply chain and bake it all into a number that represents the CO2 emissions that are embodied in a certain product or that refer to a certain investment. And there are still many questions that are unanswered. Standards exist, reporting systems exist, I'll get to that in a minute, but they often use different languages, and this is difficult because there is no final answer for each player involved to questions such as, for example, how if I am an automaker, how should I account for the proportion of scrap metal that has gone into the steel mill that has produced the steel that I have embodied in the car that I'm producing? Or if I am producing aluminum, let's say, should I be considered responsible if the aluminum that I've produced is then sold to an automaker that produces a diesel car with it? The emissions from the diesel, should it be something that ends up in my reporting? And all these questions stack up and create a system where it is really hard to create accountability. And when you can't create accountability, you can't create the reverse positive aspect of it, which is bankability of virtuous efforts that are being made. So it really is to us a game of creating a common language that the existing reporting ecosystem can put in place. And that is why we have created COMET. COMET stands for the Coalition on Materials Emissions Transparency. And the idea is to gather, as I said at the beginning, industrial players that are interested in creating this common language to make emissions reporting easier for themselves and bankable. The principles that we are going to work with are that we want to leverage the existing reporting platforms and tools, doing so in a collaboration with industry and existing stakeholders, and foster the adoption of methodologies that are based on the GHG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We are planning to start by focusing on several metals. Some of the reason for that is that these metals are key in numeric terms, in terms of size, to the abatement of emissions. And in other cases, they are metals that are key to the transition, in the sense that if the energy transition is going to imply high degrees of electrification, for example, you will have certain metals that will be implied, and you want to be sure that the supply chains of those metals are bolted on to a 1.5 degree scenario. And so we will start by looking into iron and steel and copper, and then battery, energy minerals, probably aluminum. The whole idea is, as I said, we need verifiable and comparable protocols to be able to share emissions information. I wanted to stress this point by showing you a preliminary chart of the galaxy of reporting that supply chain players are faced with when it comes to documenting their emissions and understanding the supply chains. And this is it. Of this, of course, we will not cover the detail, but I want you to get an idea of the complexity of the situation, and think that each of those players have different goals and different requirements, and in many cases their own specific method for reporting emissions. Now, this is a little bit problematic, and it also means that there is a limited scope for the possibility to create that signaling method from consumer to producer about decarbonization. Right now, a manufacturer of a final product is not able to source low carbon commodities, for example. There is no such market, and the creation of a standard method would enable that market to exist. This is what we call market differentiation in commercial jargon, when you create a product that has a specific attribute, in our case to be low carbon in content, and that can attract a green premium, in the sense that the product has an additional value and a specific market can be created for it. So the idea is that the COMET method will not only enhance the current reporting system, but actually create potential new markets for low carbon commodities. It will help investors address climate risk. It can be used as the basis for policy mechanisms. So you will have heard about the debate in the European Union, for example, about the border adjustment for emissions. That is one area that will probably need a standard method for assessment. And as I said, it will unlock green commodity markets. So I will stop here, and I hope I have been clear enough in explaining what our goals are with COMET, and we might get questions, and I'll be happy to get more in depth into it. But I would like now to invite our two panelists that we have with us today, because the idea is, it's one thing for us to put out the concept for standard methods and the need for standardization of reporting, but we want to hear from the market what they think and to what extent this can help. So I'm joined here today by Virginia Covo Naranjo, Global Director of Supply Chain Sustainability at Anheuser-Busch. which you might know as being the world's largest brewer, associated with several of the brands that you will certainly know about. And Alana Fishman, Vice President of Advisory Services at Cornerstone Government Affairs, who is an expert in ESG reporting and deals on a daily basis with the reporting of ESG attributes, including carbon emissions from companies. So first of all, I want to make sure that we have both of them on the line and that they are able to react. Alana and Virginia.
Hi, Paolo. Yes, this is Alana. I can hear you.
Okay. All right. And I think Virginia might still have some connection issues. So why don't we start, Alana, by talking about how you see this whole play being useful to your day-to-day, and in particular, I think it would be useful if you can specify how the ESG angle differs from general sustainability initiatives, and then, of course, how it applies in today's markets. Where are the pain points that streamlined methodologies can help?
Absolutely, I'm happy to. Well, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And as Paolo mentioned, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on this webinar today. Thrilled to be here. Just as a quick overview of Cornerstone, I work in the advisory services sector, which my role is to help companies from across industry verticals implement ESG programs as it pertains to their specific company. And so what's unique about this is, as the ESG paradigm shift has really taken over capital markets in discussions and even just priorities, as we've seen from BlackRock and State Street, everybody's really moving to integrate ESG, which for those of you on the phone who don't know, ESG stands for environmental social governance. And companies are moving quickly to integrate this now because of the fact it has been proven to drive financial, reputational, and brand value. So, Paolo, to answer one of the questions you posed is, what is the difference between ESG and general sustainability concerns in the market? Sustainability and CSR have always carried positive weight for corporations to act as good citizens, good social actors in their communities. And what's unique about ESG is that has been the defining factor to tie financial value to sustainability indicators. So whether that's profit and revenue, assets and liabilities, or cost of capital, those specific financial indicators are now specifically linked to ESG indicators. So why COMET is such a unique and fantastic opportunity is because it is honing in on one of the most important metrics that fall in the ESG category, which is emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And from our clients across verticals, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, most, if not all, of these companies are having to adapt their business models to best report on how their emissions profile, specifically carbon, can be better managed to address not only the company's long-term value and risk, but also just how are they acting in the broader global markets. And as you mentioned, Paulo, investors are really driving this. It's the right thing to do for companies to focus on these indicators, but ultimately, because of the financial value that has been tied to ESG indicators and specifically emissions, investors are now really pushing their companies, their portfolios, to say, how are you addressing us? What is your perception of the risk your company has in operating with your current emissions profile, and how are you planning to mitigate it? So that's really where the opportunity comes in for COMET in looking at the emissions, how companies report on it from both the Scope 1, Scope 2 direct, and then Scope 3 supply chain, and how these companies integrate that into their risk management.
And Alana, this is all very interesting. I think what strikes me is the sense of urgency that you cast on this. Since I know that you deal with your clients on a daily basis, I was wondering if you could give us some color of how much is this front and center, and what amount of pressure is there from investors or from the side of a company that needs to report.
Yeah, absolutely. So about 5 years ago, this was a conversation that was interesting and compelling, but not really acted upon quickly, and brought into the company's holistic risk management. Within the past year or so, we've seen companies across industry verticals really starting to embrace the empirical evidence that financial and brand and reputational value is directly linked to companies actually implementing an ESG program. So very key differentiator here is there's the concept of greenwashing, where you're saying we're doing all the right things. We believe that you need to manage your environmental, social, governance indicators, and we intend to do that. And it's a completely different story for a company to actually go into their operating model and determining where these risks lie and how they actually are mitigating against it. So what we've seen just from Cornerstone's perspective is, although we have had clients now for a while, ever since the BlackRock and State Street announcements were made that these, the world's largest asset managers are going to officially either be divesting from or shifting capital away from the companies that are not implementing ESG, where that really lit a fire. They're really moving now. Companies are actively integrating these programs, and they are looking to drive that value. What's unique is we feel that there are three key players here. It's companies, investors, and then rating agencies, and that's what's driving this continued cycle of capital market integration. Companies no longer have that opt-out option to say, we're not really interested in sustainability right now. We have other drivers to give our shareholders value. With social media and the internet, companies, if anything happens, their brand and reputation is on the line within seconds of it happening and it being pushed out through all these different feeds. And so now the value that companies have is really tied to them controlling the narrative for their own companies. And the best way to do that is have a fundamental ESG program where you have proof behind the pudding as to what you're doing to manage your GHG emissions, like carbon. Investors are, as you mentioned, Paulo, are putting that pressure on them to report that out. And you've also mentioned that what's different is there is no standardization. So the opportunity that we're discussing with COMET today is truly an opportunity. There's no standard way to report ESG and carbon and its impact and the financial value to it, just because companies can do that for what is best fits for their company. And so this type of methodology will really bring that comparability and that reliability that needs to come behind reporting, so investors are able to make informed decisions as to how different companies are managing this. And it's monetized, as you mentioned before. How is it monetized? Because these companies are able to say, listen, if I control how much carbon is tied to my product, that can help increase your customer base and your market segment. And as regulatory conversations continue to flow through the market, if there ever was a price on carbon, that will increase the general cost of supplies needed for your final product. So that's how it changes.
But from an investor perspective, I would assume that the companies that are that investors invest in would report TCFD, for example. Can't I use those numbers? How does that work? Because we then hear from investors that say that they lack the adequate data.
So you're asking how does the current reporting framework of TCFD work for investors, and is that enough for them to have that standardization?
Yeah.
Yeah, TCFD. So TCFD and SASB have really come out as front runners in the market right now for reporting frameworks. SASB stands for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. they have done the due diligence to link that financial value I was mentioning earlier to sustainability indicators. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is meant essentially to do the same thing and to tie financial value to climate and carbon emissions. And that's actually why we see BlackRock and State Street specifically saying that they are requiring now their portfolio companies to bring those two frameworks into their reporting disclosure because of the fact it ties to financial disclosure. And what we're talking about in GHG emissions and carbon, this fits perfectly into those frameworks as well. If it's material and if it drives value for a company, this is exactly the type of transparency that would dovetail very nicely into those types of frameworks that investors are looking for.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks. I'm getting carried away because this is a very interesting conversation. At the same time, I realize that it's a bit going on to the technical. And I would also like to introduce our other guest today that in the meantime, I think has managed to overcome the technical difficulties. And is that right, Virginia? Do we have you on the line?
Yes, I'm on the line. I'm sorry.
Oh, great, great to have you here. I was going to introduce you because that will also bring, I think, the conversation closer to what many of our attendees today will be able to relate more directly to, right? Because as I said earlier, Anheuser-Busch is a brewer, so everyone has experience with beers. So I just wanted to let you introduce yourself quickly, and maybe if you can answer for us the burning question we all have: what is the CO2 emissions of a brewer mostly related to the bubbles in the beer, or is that something else?
Well, I'll introduce myself. So as you said, Paolo, I'm Director of Supply Chain Sustainability at AB InBev. I manage our climate action goal, and I'm as part of our 2025 sustainability goals, and I measure our carbon footprint, taking into account scopes 1, 2, and 3. As you all know, we rely on natural ingredients. So the reason we're actually in the sustainability space is because it is our business. We need to make sure that we're here for the next 100 years, right? Yes, investors are asking for this. It's something that we see more and more. It's something that we recognize, but it's also something that we've been doing for years. What we managed to do now is to expand towards our value chain, which was new starting 2017. So before we were very focused on internal emissions and logistics. So to answer your question, Paolo, that was a bit of a surprise for our senior leaders when we measured our scope 3 emissions and compared them to the bubbles that you say are generated by the fermentation process or from the germination process when we're doing malting, because we're highly verticalized. What we saw is that 80% of our emissions lie on our value chain. So it's pretty big in comparison to what we have inside. So not only do we need to engage with our supply base to make sure, but to engage them on how are we going to decarbonize our supply chain, especially packaging materials that represent about 1/3 of our emissions. So around 36% comes from packaging materials, right? So how do we engage with them? And not only that, the difficulty comes is that everybody reports very differently. So that's where I see the value of COMET as well in standardizing. So most of the times the way that our suppliers are reporting, it's data that I cannot even use in my own reporting, because they're either doing revenue or unit or number of employees. So it's very hard, one, to gather the data, and then once you got the data, that it actually makes sense with what we need as the customer. So that's kind of, I know I'm running ahead of the other questions, but I think that's where a lot of our issues arise, and that's where we use a hybrid method to determine our carbon footprint. But a lot of the times we end up using a lot of the proxies or theoretical data because we don't have transparency on our supply chain. Yeah,
no, that's all great, and I think it ties well with the conversation. Alana earlier was saying that pressure is mounting, and the companies cannot really opt out anymore of adopting targets. So I'm curious to see if you have or are planning to adopt a target, and how you address the scope 3 issue, because if it's 80% of your emissions, that is going to be front and center in decarbonization. And I don't even know what materials that would be about. Is it, you know, aluminum, glass, whatever comes from the supply chain, right?
So we have a target. We adopted a science-based target. So our target, if you look into our full science-based target, is we're going to reduce our emissions by 35% on scopes 1 and 2 in absolute terms. We're going to reduce our emissions across our supply chain 25% per hectoliter, and we're going to achieve 100% renewable electricity. So we have those 3 targets, and they're validated by the Science-Based Target Initiative, and we're also part of the RE100 movement. The way that we're tackling it, first, I mean, it's a very complex model that we built to measure our full emissions, and we take it into each portion of our supply chain. The reason why packaging is so high is exactly what you said. So making glass is very energy intensive. It's much more energy intensive than making beer. Extracting aluminum, like the bauxite and the alumina from the mines, is very energy intensive as well, and we buy a lot. So we're the biggest purchaser, we're the biggest glass purchaser in the world, and we're the second largest beverage, like canned beverage purchaser in the world. So if you add that together and you look at the emissions of everything that we're buying, so we're buying close to 3 million tons of glass every year for one-way glass. So it's a ton of glass, right? So we are responsible for those emissions. So how do we work? I mean, yes, how do we work with our suppliers? And we have we created a platform for collaboration, but to focus on transparency is how do we gather the data, and how do we actually report in a consistent manner in a way that we can all speak the same language?
Right. Yeah, and it's quite interesting what you say about the lack of reliable numbers and a method. I was thinking about your supply chain. I was wondering if you have visibility into what happens when you say, you know, the bauxite and the aluminum mining, for example. I guess you don't buy directly from the aluminum miner, and so how do you get an insight on the actual emissions that happen at that stage? My wild guess will be that you will be bound to using industry averages, and so there is no way that you can actually influence emissions.
So we have, so yes and no, because we have industry averages for both. One, we actually do buy can sheet, fortunately, so we can go very back into the supply chain, and we're very fortunate to do that, and that's because we're verticalized and we have can manufacturing facilities. What we do there is we do have industry averages. If we cannot engage with the ingot production guy, we have industry averages for virgin material and for recycled content. And we are gathering recycled content at a supplier level as well. Reason why we do that is because we have another goal, which is that the majority our packaging will be made of majority recycled content. That's our circular packaging goal. So we are getting industry averages, but we're using realistic numbers when it comes to recycled content. And that's why we use recycled content. If you use recycling rates, it's going to make your calculations and your life much, much harder because you don't know exactly where that aluminum is going into, and you will not be able to even estimate what the emissions of that manufacturing process is.
All right. Yeah, that's super relevant. Thanks. It's also relieving to hear that you take care of the circular economy effect, so the recycling after use. Just as a fun fact, I had a party at my place the other night, and we figured out that most of our trash after the party was aluminum and glass because of the drinks, and we put it all in the recycling, and so it's great to know that there is that angle as well. I wonder if it gets captured correctly in the current methodologies for reporting. That is probably up for discussion, right? I think it is time that we start engaging the audience. If you agree, we might have some questions coming in. I was just going to ask Kelly if you have code questions already.
Absolutely. We have some great questions from attendees here. And again, if you have questions that you'd like to pose to our panel, go ahead and enter them into the questions section of your control panel. And the first question is actually is addressed to Alana. Alana, do you see the same drive to employ ESG for privately held companies? And is there a significant push by private equity firms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. You know, this really did, the ESG movement really did start in capital markets for public companies, the ones that have to report out through SEC regulations. But because of the long-term value that is derived by implementing a legitimate ESG program, private companies are moving in this space very, very quickly. And we're seeing that they're, you know, between general partners and limited partners in the space of private equity, there are now mandates for these investors before they're allowed to, you know, bring certain companies into their portfolio, just because the market is demanding that companies consider these ESG frameworks now before they're, you know, officially brought in for investment. So that's absolutely the trend that we're seeing. Hedge funds are discussing it as well. It's absolutely permeating the market from all angles.
Great. And our next question, we actually have two questions that are somewhat similar. So the first one is that, you know, my understanding of COMET is that it helps to bring standardization to reporting of GHG in the industrial sector, but there are other disclosure protocols. So what is different about COMET, and what does it provide that existing protocols lack? And then I would say that a question that's similar is, can you explain how COMET differs in the process of conducting a life cycle assessment for a specific product? So Paolo, I'll start with you, and then maybe you can you know, queue up a few of our panelists as well.
All right, yes. So I will say that, first of all, the first question, how does it differ from the existing disclosure ecosystem? The idea is that it will integrate it. It will not replace any of what exists. First of all, because what exists has been created over the years, and it comes from the bottom up, and it's already a great effort and very useful in many use cases. There is an issue about having a standard language that covers the entire supply chain, and there are some gaps in certain materials, and the need for harmonization in certain methodologies. So what COMET will do is undertake research and come to an integrable method that would be adopted by existing reporting platforms. It will not replace any of that. I'll make an example that is that we have been discussing, because we are starting to work on, like I said, on the iron and steel supply chain. There are several, in fact, ISO standards that relate to the iron and steel supply chain, and these, of course, are good, and we will draw from those to create the integrated COMET method. So that's to the first question. How does it differ from life cycle analysis? In many cases it will not. But the problem that we have with the way life cycle analysis works in the realm of enabling sustainable procurement is that it mostly works based on industry averages, and although that leads you to being in many cases 90 to 95% right about the emission content of a product, it will not be able to send, since it's not being based on actual numbers, it will not send the demand signal up the supply chain to do something different. So in other words, I can build a car with materials that are whose carbon content I know, I estimate by an industry average. But until I can decide to discriminate between a supplier of low carbon steel and another supplier, I will never be able to send that signal to do something upwards in the supply chain. And that is what we need to be doing, and we need to be doing it fast if we want to be able to stay within the IPCC 1.5 scenarios. So that's my answer. I'm happy for our panelists to chime in because they will have direct experience of this, I think.
I can add something, and it's not only that, right? Sometimes a lot of the platforms allow you to report and you just put like an average, right? So for me, it's hard to know where exactly, because we like to do things at scale, but we also want to do things in the markets where we operate to make sure that we're having the right impact. So when we talk about a global average, it's very hard for us to know where exactly the opportunity is. And today, unfortunately, we don't have that platform where I can actually identify where are the main opportunities. If you think about the steel industry, the aluminum industry, the glass industry, today I cannot pinpoint where in my supply chain do I have the biggest opportunities other than recycled content and the grid matrix. And okay, I'm adding, just like I bring additionality on renewables, which we're working with our suppliers to also transition into renewables. Where are the main gaps in terms, especially like heat energy, or where can we bring that technology? Where can we pilot? Like today, we don't have that visibility because there's no available platform to actually show that.
And actually that gets us to our next question, which is posed to you, Virginia. If in a perfect world, what input data do you wish you had available to you to make tracking or verifying emissions more accurate?
I mean, if I'm talking about me and what I want selfishly, I would want to know, I know where I'm buying from, so I know how much material I'm buying from each supplier on every site. That's easy for me to track. My ideal world would be to know what are the emissions, at least scope 1 and 2, which is what I can influence the most from those suppliers in that supply chain, to be able to understand where the impact of our projects are and how can we actually collaborate to create those projects. So we have an amazing startup on our cohort this year. So we have a sustainability accelerator that is taking solar energy to create heat, renewable heat, right? Where there's not a lot of solutions for heat energy. Mostly we're talking about electricity. That is an amazing solution that could be applicable in the aluminum industry, or not in glass because the temperatures are too high, but in other industries, right? In the paper industry. So I don't know exactly where my main opportunities are because I don't have visibility of each country. So in my ideal world, I would at least have visibility at a country level so that I know where I can action and where will I have the biggest impact to decrease our extended carbon footprint.
Great, and this next question is to Alana. In your view, is the mining industry in general terms at a stage of readiness to effectively participate in the COMET method, or are there any specific companies that you would think about as leaders as this gets developed and rolled out?
I think just to start off answering this in a general perspective, the extractive industries in general, so mining, oil and gas, anything that has to do with getting product out of the ground, just by the inherent nature of those operations, they're just more intensive on the environment, right? And so they're really under the microscope right now for what I was mentioning before in terms of investors really looking for these companies to proactively engage, and also rating agencies looking for these companies to engage. And what's happening is, just to quickly delve into rating agencies, they're looking at companies, let's stick to the private or the public sector right now. They're looking at companies and saying, we see your sustainability profile and we think you deserve this letter or number score to really hone in on this singular point of value to put out to the market for investors to look at. So you might get, AAA rating if you're at the top, or a numeric value to show how well you're doing in the sustainability realm. And if companies don't implement a program that manages these risks, they're going to be rated and judged. Investors are going to continue shifting capital, with or without their participation. So to answer your question, mining certainly does have a role to play in this space. And I think as it pertains to COMET, the opportunity here is the market is demanding transparency and reporting as it pertains to emissions and carbon. And we're already seeing actors in this space trying to manage what Paolo was mentioning before is, the opportunity to create a green market, a commodity market, and create that premium differentiator for those products that manage emissions. This methodology is coming out at a fantastic time because companies are already moving in this realm. Natural gas is trying to certify, some natural gas companies, I should say, are trying to certify natural gas as green. So, it's not so far left field to feel that, the mining industry materials will also want to figure out how they can create that differentiator for them as well through a consistent methodology like COMET. But I certainly think the opportunity is there.
Yeah, I would like to chime in on the mining side. Because so we've started COMET with the idea of gathering members, founding members from all the supply chain of key metals for a start. So we wanted to have, of course, producers and investors, but also miners and steel makers, heavy processes. And it's in the mining constituency, we are finding a lot of fertile ground for the idea. Mining companies, although are pretty removed from final consumers, are under very heavy pressure from investors to do something. And as I said at the beginning, it once used to be just doing something on scope 1 and 2, so direct emissions. Now it's all about scope 3. And some mining companies that have downstream in their supply chain heavy processes, I'm thinking iron and steel, are having real issues with scope 3 emissions, to the point that you have some of the global miners, I'm thinking of BHP having pledged for $100 million to address scope 3 emissions, which means looking into outside their own direct operations and into companies that they supply to do something for reducing emissions. So this is the extent of the focus. We are working in close conjunction with the likes of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM. That is an industry association of responsible miners that have ESG and sustainable development goals at heart, as well as, of course, with other industry associations like the World Steel Association and so on. We are in talks with all these players. So yeah, there is a lot of interest from upstream in supply chains.
Great, and our last question actually comes to us from a member of RMI's Innovator Circle, Richard Landers. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today and for your question. And the question is, the COMET method makes good sense in theory, but what does it look like specifically as it's rolled out across the industry? So maybe you can give us an example, how long you think this will take, and what really goes into making COMET an operating reality across the industry.
All right, of course I can. So we have, like I said in the beginning, we are collaborating as 4 institutions creating COMET, and the way we are going to operationalize the concept is having a work plan that will carry us through the research and the industry interaction that is needed to build the methods. We have decided to work in a mineral-specific manner, so to address a mineral supply chain one by one, and starting from iron and steel and the other key metals, probably soon straddling into other materials that are not just minerals because of the pressures from other supply chains. we estimate that each mineral supply chain will take between 12 to 18 months to deliver an actual method. And of course, we will work this in a parallel manner, so that we want to start working on all those 4 key minerals in the current year, and then move on to more. I actually have a slide. I don't know if I'm still presenting, but I'm moving to a much more concrete slide on what our work plan looks like for the time being. We have this methodology building stream where, like I said, we will generate the methodology for up to 4 selected minerals with the idea of having them ready by early next year or mid next year max. We know that we need to work on anchoring those methodologies in the current ecosystem, and we are already in talks with the likes of the CFD and CDP and the Responsible Steel, Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. So the various adopters, reporting platforms that can adopt. And also we want to drive industry adoption. So we will start engaging those companies that have not funded the creation of the method, but are interested in adopting. So this is how we will go about it. How does the method looks like? In the end, it will be something like a company reporting to TCFD using the COMET method. And in this way, if I am an investor and I need to make an assessment on that company, I know what method has been used to generate those numbers, and I can therefore mix and match it with other companies that likewise have used that method. And then you can translate the same example into other parts of the supply chain and all the other use cases.
Wonderful. And any final thoughts from our other panelists on what's next for the COMET method from your perspective?
I look forward to working on this. That's my only comment. Very happy that this is happening.
I agree as well. I look forward to, this is a really incredible opportunity, and I think the conversation is very pertinent and timely. And so this, I look forward to it as well.
Well, excellent. Thank you to all of you, to all of our panelists today. We really appreciate everything you shared with us, and we look forward to following up with what's next with the COMET method. And to all of our attendees for joining today, thank you so much for the insightful questions. And although we didn't have time to get to all of them today, we'll be sure to address all of them in an upcoming blog post, so stay tuned. So we look forward to keeping you both informed and inspired about the market innovations that are helping us address the 7 challenges for global energy transformation and building a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. Obviously, if you're not familiar with the 7 challenges, we encourage you to download the report and learn more about how these challenges apply to your company or organization. And especially, we'd love to engage with you further and learn more about what you took away, not only from this webinar today, but what would resonate with you in particular during future webinars. So you can see an email address right down there. Think about these 3 questions and perhaps think about emailing us at es@rmi.org with some of your responses to these, and we look forward to working those into future webinars in this series. And of course, as a nonprofit organization, this and all of our work is made possible by donor support. So if you like what you've heard today and want to play a role in scaling COMET and other innovations to make emissions visible, please consider what you can do to advance this work or joining our giving circles, and you can learn more at rmi.org. So thank you again to everyone for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.